The temporary traffic calming pieces on 97 through 102nd are not working. We need to close the streets. The mayor has the opportunity and ability to do that, and I would love to see that happen this week.
Well, it is a story that is continuing to develop this week. The City Council President, Joy Hollingsworth, calling on Mayor Wilson to close down streets in North Seattle on an emergency basis rather than wait for the process of legislation to go through. What's happening on Aurora Avenue North? What are neighbors doing up there, and how is the mayor going to respond? Plus, a new ordinance laying out the duties of Seattle's care teams, the city's alternative 911 response. That's on the City Council's docket this week in the midst of a labor battle for the union that represents those teams. And isn't it fair that people pay their fare on Sound Transit trains? Some new details on the issue of fare evasion emerging here. Glad to have you with us. We are talking about all that and more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on the Seattle channel. The views expressed here are mine, and I'm with my friend and co-host David Croman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. And David, I have a number of out-of-town guests coming to Seattle this week for a nephew's graduation. I'm trying to explain the month of June to them because when they arrived, there were thunderstorms. And then in a few days, it's going to be up over 90 degrees here in the Seattle metro area. Any ideas? What do I tell these folks?
Yeah, I feel like June is the least predictable month. The thunderstorms thing that's a little rare. Even I don't really remember that being a product of June. I do remember the January, kind
yes.
of cold and drizzly and gray. But yeah, the wild swings feel like a different animal.
It's a lot. I know that. So I'm hoping for safe skies in the weekend ahead here. We'll see how it goes. Thank you, David, as always. Thanks to our background noise sponsor, City Grind Espresso on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks to our patrons. A shout out to Linda. Always great to have your feedback. Thank you for the continued support. If you want to be cool like Linda, be a patron, why don't you? Head to Patreon, check it out. Giving levels start at just $5 a month. You will get access to Patrons First podcast. You'll get a cool-looking decal like this. And above all, you will be supporting local journalism. Thank you. Find Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon and support the show. A shout-out to Converge Media. The video version of the program is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's rock and or roll. Time for Right Here, Right Now. Well, our top story still this week, a developing one regarding Aurora Avenue North. Seattle's City Council President Joy Hollingsworth is calling on Mayor Wilson to close 5 streets off of Aurora Avenue North, saying temporary traffic calming measures that have been installed there last week to prevent gun violence are simply not working. So there was this meeting on Monday. Hollingsworth was talking about this. They're asking the mayor to close North 97th through 102nd Streets at Aurora, 2 vehicles, no later than this week. David, I wanted to talk about this. I know this is a bit of a moving target here, but it sounds like a lot of neighbors were out in force over the weekend, marching, rallying, saying we need these streets shut down, and I think the council's trying to respond to that.
Yeah, and I think, we've talked about the tension between the council and the mayor's office. I think that is kind of clearest when it comes to public safety, around the cameras, and now we're on Aurora, and I think the council is getting to a place where it feels a little more confident in using its authority as a separate legislative branch and using that to kind of pressure the mayor into doing what they want. And a lot of the members of this council voted in favor of, say, the soap laws up in Aurora and the soda laws, and right. They're feeling like they want to, I think, reclaim some of the upper hand on public safety, and I think that's what they're doing here. There is a bill to shut these streets down, but it seems like that's kind of more leverage to get the mayor to just declare these streets closed. It sounds like the mayor is going to take a week before she makes a decision.
Talk about that. They're trying to figure out if these traffic calming measures are working, I guess, or what's going on from the mayor's side here.
Yeah, exactly. I think they're trying to see if basic traffic calming can make a difference. Again, it's an interesting approach that we're talking about here. And I think the mayor wants to see if subtle changes to the environment can improve the broader safety picture up there. I think the street closures probably come with a little more pretext, perhaps has a negative connotation, but gives officers a little more pretext to intervene in a way that I think SOAP was intended to do also, because, it's one thing to arrest people after there has been a shootout, but I think the thought is the city, members of the council would like to see more avenues to intervene, for officers to intervene before that happens, and closures are a piece of that.
Yeah, and I guess the council's point of view is the mayor really doesn't have to wait for this legislation to go forward. She can make this decision now, but it sounds like she's taking her time and trying to get some more information on this. But the mayor really could make this decision right now to shut down those streets, right?
She could, yeah. She hasn't. Again, I
Yeah,
think she wants to
yeah,
see what a lighter touch approach would do. I
yeah.
don't know that the people living up there have
A
maybe
lot of
much
patience
patience
for
for
that.
that.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, we'll see where this goes.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting one to watch play out here. We have a city council that is really hearing it. I know from a lot of constituents there in the North Aurora neighborhood there, the North Seattle area. And it's not just Aurora. There are parts of Greenwood that are getting affected by this too. And when the violence continues, I think that's where a lot of these neighbors are really trying to show their voice here. And again, just looking at some of the data here, as reported in the Seattle Times, that police data is really showing shootings in this area really did spike last month. 8 shootings reported in May compared to 9 between January and April. So there's a lot to be concerned about up there in that neighborhood right now. And a lot of neighbors definitely talking to their city about it. I did want to talk about another public safety issue with you, if I could, David. The Seattle City Council's Public Safety Committee this week tackling a number of thorny issues, actually, including making some changes to the ordinance that lays out the duties of the community crisis responder teams that are part of the city's care department, Community Assisted Response and Engagement. We've talked about these responders on the podcast many times before. Most recently, we discussed how the union that represents them is claiming the team's ability to work has been infringed upon by the Seattle Police Officers Guild. So the community crisis responders, the CCRs, say SPD officers aren't letting them respond to calls on private property, for example, or in situations where there might be drugs present. So the council is working on changing this up. And what I'm seeing in these revisions, these suggested revisions released this week, David, is that the city wants the CCR teams to be the first responders on behavioral health calls, and they can be dispatched via 911 or other mechanisms. I'm putting that in big air quotes there. That's what the draft ordinance says. What do you make of these potential changes, David? How might this affect the way community crisis responders are deployed in Seattle? What do you think?
Yeah, I think other mechanisms might be kind of referring to like a 988 call
Okay.
or Harbor View, because that, in some ways, it's hard for me to have a conversation about care without talking about the police contract and the labor disputes here, because that is really what's underlying a lot of this tension. Because the thing that really makes care, or is supposed to make care unique from other alternative responses, is that it is woven directly into 911. There's several organizations out there that provide outreach or case management or whatever it might be, but only CARE was going to be an organization that could be dispatched if you call 911 and say, I don't think I need a cop here. I need just someone who can help this person overdosing or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So, when we're talking about other mechanisms, that I think is fine and worthwhile. That is fundamentally different than what was imagined for care in the first place.
Right.
The 911 issue is tricky, though, because then that does get into what was the duties of a police officer as laid out in their contract, and that's what spurs these kind of labor disputes. So that's all to say, it feels like legislation at this point can only sort of necessarily nibble around the edges until there is a more kind of full-throated confrontation of what's actually laid out in the contract.
I do think, though, and I've heard this from a few council members, maybe care units could actually just be kind of driving around these different neighborhoods, let's say, and if they see a problem that maybe hasn't been reported to 911 at all, they can act proactively and actually look after that person who they can see is in the middle of a behavioral health crisis. I guess maybe that could be part of it too for care.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm not smart enough to know exactly how the labor stuff works out to know how that would intersect. If I recall, in one email that I got a few months ago from the care department, they had talked about a time when care officers had actually gone onto a private property. I think it was a parking lot.
Yes. Yeah. Of a supermarket. Yeah.
I think it was an on-view response. And then when somebody then eventually did call 911, when the officers showed up, they said, hey, basically, you got to leave. So I don't know that necessarily solves the problem. But, if perhaps officers decide never to respond to that call, then maybe that could be a balancing act there. Again, I think you can kind of massage this, but to really kind of create a situation where care officers are responding to 911 calls without any sort of officer involvement, it does feel like there needs to be a bigger discussion around the next contract.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely something that's coming to a head here, and we'll see what's next with CARE. That's a developing story there as well. I did also want to talk about some of the other things on the docket for the Public Safety Committee, chock full of stuff this week. There was a report on the expansion of this neighborhood ambassador program. This is as they're called in Ballard and Chinatown ID. These new neighborhoods getting these ambassadors here. The data showing some good results with these non-police units on the street helping deal with street disorder. And I also wanted to crack this one open with you, David. A report on SPD overtime as well as officer recruitment and retention. I saw a few things in this report. One, Seattle is starting to gain back officers, but slowly. In the last 2 quarters, SPD has had 13 fewer separations, meaning officers leaving, and 5 fewer hires than previously projected. So there are 8 officers ahead on their staffing plan. And if the trends continue, SPD would have a budget gap of about $1.7 million by the year's end. So hiring may have to slow down. I thought this was very interesting. It sounds like some of these officers that they had thought might be moving on, sounds like they're sticking around. What does this tell you when it comes to police hiring and what's going on here?
Yeah, I think, there's has been a lot made of the number of officers that SPD is or isn't hiring over the last year, and that has certainly picked up. I do think the bigger story in some ways is that separations have just slowed down enormously. That was really what was driving a lot of the declines, is just huge numbers of officers were leaving. The number of separations now looks a little more kind of pre-pandemic typical of what you would expect of a police department.
Right.
That there's always going to be separations, retirements, people move, some number of firings, but it is starting to look a little bit like what I remember it looking like in 2019 and even earlier.
Yeah, a lot
So
less
that,
of
I
it.
think,
And I was going to say, I mean, this is really coincides with this big pay bump that these officers got not too long ago.
yeah, I mean, that to me has always been, there has been a lot of effort, around making the hiring process a little smoother. And of course, there's this kind of soft side of projecting a kind of more pro law enforcement stance out of City Hall. And I'm sure that stuff does make a difference. It is hard to ignore, though, that hiring increased and retentions and separations slowed almost immediately after the Seattle police officers became the highest paid in the state. I think money above all else does talk. I mean,
Yeah.
because before then, I think they were like 15th or maybe even worse paid in the state. And there were so many other departments that paid more and were offering these enormous signing bonuses. I think it just became way too tempting for a lot of officers to take that, especially when a lot of them live in Seattle anyway. It's not like they have a particular attachment to working in Seattle. Now, if you go and work for Seattle, you're going to be, by a fairly significant margin, the best paid in the state. You can make a lot of money, a lot of overtime opportunities. I will always see that as the kind of number one explanation. Again, it's a very political issue with a lot wrapped up in, what the previous councils did or didn't say around defunding the police or the support for the police and, cultural tension and all that. I just think at the end of the day, if you pay people enough, they're going to be more likely to stick around.
Yep, makes sense to me. And a lot going on with this report, folks. If you can dive into it this week with the Public Safety Committee, it's worth looking at here. I did notice that the numbers that the SPD is hiring when it comes to female candidates, I know they were hoping to have 30% of the department represented as women by the year 2030. They're not on a great path for that. The most recent recruiting numbers are looking like it's a 10% hiring rate of female candidates there. And so there's some concern there. And I did want to bring up, too, overtime spending in this report. It looks like the use of OT is down at most precincts, but that may increase, I'm guessing, if the department needs more hotspot policing, like what's going on Aurora. Any thoughts about overtime spending? That's been a big political issue over the past several years, too.
Yeah, I mean, there has been some pressure on SPD to rein in overtime spending, though there seems to be a pattern of asking for forgiveness rather than permission when it comes to overtime spending. And at the same time, the officer numbers are still below 1,000 when they used to be around 12, 1,300. So it is how the police department is covering a lot of those missing hours.
Right.
There's going to be a lot of overtime opportunities around the World Cup, but I think most of that is going to be reimbursable from outside grants.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of strategies around Aurora, around 12th and Jackson involve neighbors calling for more police around there all the time. And that requires overtime. So it's a balancing act. It's a tough budget year. The SPD is going to go over its budget, while other departments are going to be asked to make cuts. That's perhaps going to be a little hard to swallow for some people. But, Mayor Katie Wilson on the campaign trail said she wanted a more consistent officer presence at 12th and Jackson.
Right.
was always sort of amused at the fact that it was her out of the two of them who was calling for that heightened officer presence. To do that, though, you got to pay people.
Yeah. Also, how does this affect response times with overtime? That's still a bit of a mixed bag for the SPD as well, looking some at those numbers. So a big conversation ahead for the Public Safety Committee and the entire council as they look towards budget considerations later on this fall. Thank you for that, David. And let's keep talking about public safety and the World Cup, because World Cup preparations are in fever pitch and there are some major investments in public safety coming to Seattle. We're going to break down some of the details next on Now Hear This. A team of emergency service agencies has unveiled a $32 million public safety plan for the World Cup matches set to kick off here in Seattle in a matter of days. What is that plan going to look like? Here's some insight from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
We've trained and rehearsed a range of scenarios, and we have identified staging areas in the event that we need to have life-saving teams come into this area.
David, I want to break down this public safety plan for Seattle here with these World Cup matches kicking off June 15th. There is this $32 million grant from FEMA that's funding a massive influx of first responders to our state from all over the place. Even a second helicopter from Spokane will be flying over to assist King County's Guardian 1 chopper. And everybody from the Sheriff's Department to the FBI and the DEA spoke at this press conference on Monday. The statistic that stuck out for me, though, David, wasn't really the 750,000 people expected in town. A lot of people have been going on about that, but it was the fact that these matches will be going on over the course of 39 days. So not a Super Bowl, for example, where you've got a week of craziness leading up to the game. We're talking about 5+ weeks of pretty heightened alert, and that's going to put a lot of strain, I think, on our region's public safety response.
And there's just not a lot of precedent for this. I think if it was one big event, you could kind of anticipate what that would look like.
Yeah, I heard that from a few officers. They're like, we've never done this before, but here's our plan, etc.
Right. So it's like, I don't know, how do you kind of ratchet this stuff up and down over the course of that period? Because what are there, 6 matches total? So in some ways, those would be, I don't want to say easy, but law enforcement and first responders know how to handle a big event at a stadium. I was at the Mariners game 3 or game 2 of the playoffs last year at the same time as the Seahawks were playing.
Right.
That's not unprecedented. It is the kind of drawn out nature of it that strikes me as something that maybe they won't totally know how to handle. My guess is probably what ends up happening is you have periods of people waiting around. I don't know. I would guess that they probably will end up erring on the side of too many people with not enough to do rather than the other way around. So, and in that case, what you have to lose is money and resources, which is probably at the end of the day preferable to taking their eye off the ball and letting something happen.
Oh, yeah. They want to stay safe. Some really interesting stuff in terms of how they're responding to drone activity there. They want to make sure that they're keeping a close eye on that. I know the state has a really close eye on that piece. But I did want to fold into the discussion here the fact that Mayor Katie Wilson decided late last Friday of last week to turn on the surveillance cameras around the stadium district. I think this issue just turned into a bit of a political hot button for Wilson. She said she would turn them on in the event of a credible threat. That's what we heard a few weeks ago. Got a lot of pushback from the council's Public Safety Committee chair, Bob Kettle. She was briefed by the FBI, the Seattle Police, and apparently was convinced there was a, quote, general but credible threat. And that's led to a bunch of questions from the council, too. What is that threat? Should Seattleites be concerned? Some thoughts, David, about how the mayor is handling this surveillance camera issue.
Yeah, it felt like, and you could kind of sense this at the time, that she was trying to offer a solution that could kind of walk the line and not anger her base while also, not ruling out the possibility of actually using these cameras. And so she had the credible threat standard. Because the problem with having a credible threat standard is a few. One, can you guarantee that you would get that signal of a credible threat in advance?
Sure.
And if so, if you do get that threat, and then she says, okay, we're turning on these cameras, that unleashes this whole slew of panic and questions about, well, if the threat is so credible, perhaps we shouldn't have these games at all.
Right.
And so it was just, in some ways, felt like a little bit of an untenable position to be in. I had talked a little bit about Mayor Katie Wilson reversing course on this.
Yes.
The mayor's office didn't like that because they said, this is exactly what she said she was going to do. She said she would turn them on in the event of a threat. Now there's a threat. I understand what they're saying. It also feels like when we're trying to talk about a general threat, like, was there new information in this
that led you to think that there was that something was going to happen? Right.
And I don't know the answer to that, because if it was just the fact that, say, Iran is playing here and these are happening in Pride Month, Those were things that were known before. And so it does kind of raise the question of either she learned something in this briefing that she did not know before that convinced her, or it feels like she realized it probably made more sense to turn these on. And this was a kind of an explanation for doing so and looking like she was being consistent in her policy and her views on this. Either way, it is what it is. It doesn't particularly surprise me that this is where we ended because it did feel like that credible threat standard was not going to hold up. And it was going to be something that would have been really difficult to trigger without a lot of downstream consequences, say, while the games are actually going on.
Right.
If it was tied to something specific. And so it is not surprising that the general threat environment was what she used to trigger turning this on.
Fair enough. A lot still ahead with that. We'll see what happens next week. This week, though, Seattle's social housing developer will be drawing names from a lottery to move people into its first building, the 150-unit Aurora at the Market in Belltown. Social housing, as approved by Seattle voters a few years ago, is, of course, a system that has people of many income levels in the same buildings. The goal is to subsidize rents for low-income renters, keep these buildings affordable in perpetuity. As reported in the Seattle Times, more than 10,000 people have applied to live in this location with 150 spots. David, I thought this was very interesting because in looking at this report from your colleague Heidi Groover in the Times, it sounds like most of the applicants have been at the lowest income levels, earning up to 30% of the area median income. Will these units that need the higher income people to come in, are they going to get enough people to sustain the system? I know it's super early yet, but what do the numbers say to you on this?
Well, for one, it says to me that there's a lot of demand. It sounds like they're going to kind of move through these stages. The first round of lottery tickets will go to people earning the least, and then they'll kind of move up the income
Move up the
scale
ladder, yeah.
to balance it out. The real problem for the social housing developer is they kind of have to wait out the people who live there in the building right now because it's a nice building. They have told the people who live there they don't want to evict them. They don't want to push them out. And they also don't really want everyone to leave all at once because then they're not sure that they could fill it quite so quickly or the finances of it would collapse. And so they've actually told people that they're not going to raise rent. So on the one hand, we talk about 150 slots, but in reality, there's not that many even available right now. Those are kind of future slots that will only come about when people actually churn out of the building. So kind of an interesting scenario where the social housing developer, as of right now, I don't think this will be the case long term, but as of right now is essentially a landlord for a fairly nice downtown apartment building. And you're going to have a lot of people waiting in the wings for spots to open up. That will happen eventually, but that to me is the kind of most interesting dynamic right now.
This is going to be a very important test case, this being the first building here. I hear what you're saying on that piece. Are there other benchmarks you can keep an eye on to make sure this system is on track? What are you kind of thinking about when it comes to this whole system with social housing?
Yeah, I think the real test is going to be if and when they can actually build something.
Right, not take over a structure, but build something themselves, yeah.
It's one thing to fold in buildings that already exist and to promise that they are going to remain affordable forever.
Yeah.
That is not without value. That is good for the people who are living there and in the long term will open up opportunities, particularly for families to continue to live in Seattle.
Yeah.
But it is not adding new housing to the overall picture because at the end of the day, that is kind of the problem with Seattle's housing market is there's just not really enough of it. The real test is going to be, can social housing be a real provider, not just of long-term affordable housing, but new housing? And that, in a lot of ways, a lot more complicated than just buying buildings that exist because you have to go through all the permitting. And it will be easier for them because they don't have to use like federal tax credits. They're just going to have basically cash on hand. They could do some bonding, but they'll get that in a second because they have this basically endless source of revenue promised to them forever. So the financing actually is going to be fairly easy, but finding the land and actually getting the right builders to deliver on the project. And then you're starting from scratch and then finding the kind of right mix of people to keep the financial model sustainable. That in some ways is going to be the real test. This, I think, this first building is like it's sort of a coming out party for the social housing developer saying, hey, we're here, we're doing our thing. Now watch us as we kind of grow into other sectors.
Yeah, very much baby steps with this right now. Thanks, David. Coming up, who's not paying their fair share when it comes to riding transit in Seattle? More people than you might think. That story coming up on What's Next? In the news this week, a pilot project coming from Sound Transit to add fare gates to as many as 14 light rail stations Turns out fare evasion, people not paying, is rampant in the honor system used by the transit agency Sound Transit. The current estimate is 63% of people are paying, so basically a third of them, more than a third of them, are not paying. The hope is to get that closer to 95%, which could bring in $30 million a year. David, your colleague Danny Westneat was writing about this. He quoted one transit rider who said, with this system, only the suckers pay. It's one of those huge questions that I know a lot of people around Seattle have to be asking, and they should be asking. For a Sound Transit agency that is $34 billion in the red, isn't it time to push fare enforcement a little bit more? What do you think about that?
Yeah, and this is a real product of the pandemic and particularly 2020. I guess, the first thing to point out is fare enforcement is not the biggest source of revenue for Sound Transit. That is the property taxes that we pay. But, again, when you're talking about $35 billion and cutting lines, you do want to fish out every penny from every couch cushion.
Oh, yeah.
Part of the problem is there's just no world in which anyone really would experience consequences of not paying, because the warning system is such that you are given several warnings, but to keep track of who's getting the warnings, you have to be sure that those people are providing a real ID and they're doing it several times. King County Metro is doing something similar, and they had a report saying, I don't think there has been a single enforcement action against anybody who didn't pay a fare.
Right.
So, that's the one piece, is there's just no expectation that it would lead to any consequences to not pay. Some of that was an intentional policy choice, because there was data that was showing it was predominantly poor and, Black folks who were getting hit with enforcement. So there are equity questions around how you do that. But, if the goal is to collect more fares, then the current system is almost certainly not going to do that. The gate question, I think it was out of, where was it, New York? There was new gates that were installed, and it was pretty much an overnight change. They started collecting more fares. So it's not surprising that is not a conversation, that is now a conversation that's happening. They're looking at 2030 to roll some of this stuff out.
Yeah.
It's not particularly new.
I think also in the Bay Area, the BART, Bay Area Rapid Transit down there, they put in some new gates. And I think not only the bringing in the dollars or whatever else, they have found that it's cut back on criminal activity in terms of public safety that's happening on the trains, et cetera. Not just, evading fares, but some things that are more serious than that. So I think there's a few different investments here. I'm hearing the King County executive talking about it. I know that the mayor of Seattle's talking about it too. So I feel like there's some pressure headed this way. And I guess just last touch on this one, it was really interesting to see on a side note. I saw it in the Times as well, this Cross Lake segment of light rail. Since that opened, Seattle's daily light rail ridership is #1 in the United States, a huge jump in numbers, even ahead of Los Angeles, 5 times the size of the Emerald City. So if they're going to have these crowds come in, they should probably be collecting money. Anyhow, David, we need to wrap up. I am really on the fence about the Mariners. One-time all-star closer, Andres Munoz, not really looking like an all-star this year. His ERA over 5 compared to under 2 last year, and 5 blown saves compared to 10 successful ones. Should he stay in the closer position? What do you think?
Yeah, baseball is frustrating because you kind of want to change something right now, but actually in reality, the proper response is to not make any rash decisions. So I give him another few weeks. If he hasn't turned things around, then make a change, but not quite yet.
Okay. All right. His postings of cat videos are way down too, so that's a problem. He's a big cat aficionado, if you didn't know, folks. David, thank you so much. Thanks to everybody who's listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Become a patron. Check out Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Pledge $5 a month or more, and thank you for the help. Great to have you listening to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever you tune in. And to the 2 people who tuned in from Canada for the last episode, thanks, eh? Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. We'll see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2026.